Okay, so I think we can start now. Hello everyone, my name is Anissa Belal. I'm the Strategic Advisor on IHL here at the Academy. So on behalf of the Academy and the Director, Professor Robert Roth, I would like to welcome you here today. Thank you very much for taking the time to attend this event, which promises to be quite interesting. This event takes place in a series of events which is called the IHL Talks. It's the 7th IHL Talk that we have had since September of 2016 on different themes. The idea of the IHL Talk is to gather a broad community of practitioners, of students, of academics, of diplomats who are interested in humanitarian issues, but taken in the broad sense, not only on IHL. And the idea is also to have journalists among us to animate the debates and to also take these issues in a broader, to a broader public. So today's IHL Talk is on a very complex issue. The issue of territorial armed gangs and the violence that they impose on the civilians in the zones that they control. It's a complex issue not only from a legal point of view, but also from a social and political point of view. So we are here with us, we have here with us a very competent panel, if I may say, which is going to be introduced to you by Jamil Shadeh. I'm going to introduce to you Jamil Shadeh to tell you a little bit about his trajectory. The IHL Talk are filmed. It's going to be posted on our YouTube channel. So whatever we say in this room should not be confidential.
It's not Chatham rules.
It's not the Chatham rule. So yes, be aware of this.
Thank you.
And I do hope indeed that we'll, despite the fact that it's going to be filmed, that we have a frank discussion on this very interesting issue. Now, a few words about Jamil Shadeh, who is a Brazilian journalist and has been the European correspondent for the Brazilian daily O Estado de São Paulo in Geneva since 2000. In 2011 and in 2013, he was elected as the best Brazilian foreign correspondent, a prize which is given by the media organization Comuniquese. In 2015, he was chosen as one of the 40 most influential journalists in Brazil. He holds a master's degree from the Graduate Institute of International Studies in Geneva. He was one of the researchers of the Truth Commission established by the government in Brazil to investigate the crimes committed during the military dictatorship. He has done over 16 missions, both in Liberia, Burkina Faso, and other African countries. He traveled with the Pope, Benedict XVI, and Pope Francis, as well as covering different official presidential trips of 4 heads of state of Brazil around the world. He's also the author of many books, in fact 5 books, in Brazil and in the US. 2 of them were finalists in the main book prize in Brazil known as the Jabuti. In Switzerland, one of his books won the Nicolas Rivière Award. So I think we are here in very good hands to moderate this debate. Welcome to all of you. Thank you to all of you for having accepted to participate to this debate.
Well, thank you very much. I like the fact that I'm being called to animate a panel, but I know Oliver for a long time, and he's really a fun guy. Trust me. Don't have to worry about this. He's a nice guy, and I'm sure we're going to have a very lively discussion. The thing, before I pass to them and before I introduce the panelists, there's a very short story that I would like to tell you. Just to put this into perspective, the debate. The debate is very heavy, it's very complicated, it's very complex legally, and it's very sad as well. But it is also a debate that touches daily lives of people in Latin America, at least, in a very concrete way. 2 weeks ago, I was in Brazil visiting my parents. I came back from a very late dinner. When I arrived at their apartment, the concierge was still there. Obviously, he was watching football, but he was there. And I said, aren't you going home? I mean, I know him for the last 30 years. And he said, not really, there's some fighting at home. And I said, oh, what did you do now? He said, no, not me, gangs. I cannot go into the neighborhood and no one can come out. And it's actually a quite good neighborhood where he lives. He doesn't live in the favela. And I asked, how often does that happen? They said, oh, not much, once. So once a month? So no, once a week. So once a week, there's someone that actually cannot travel back or cannot go back to his house because there's an armed situation. Call it whatever you want. Huh? You have a situation, specifically in Brazil, but obviously as the paper, and this is an excellent paper showing the situation in Colombia, Mexico, and El Salvador. You have a situation in Brazil that for the last 15 years, you had 780,000 homicides. 780,000 homicides. For some time, the elite and the government thought that, well, you can deal with this with a military operation or by hiring private security guards to basically live with you and to take your kids to school. Actually, that was my childhood as well. So the real question today, not only in Brazil but in Latin America, is where are we? What are we doing? Oh, how do we call this? Is this a war? And if it's not a war, because maybe it's not a war, how do we get to peace? Because, okay, you call it whatever you want, but the situation is that you have lives of people being harmed every single day. Now, before I pass the question to Oliver, the situation, in a way, does evolve, and at least now the discussion is very present. For some time, society, the elite, and the government in I would say Latin America, had a very cynical perspective, sometimes very racist, and perpetually very unjust, of saying, well, this actually happens in the periphery of the towns. It doesn't touch the rich, white, wealthy families. But now it does. So now it became national topics, national priorities. Now it became a situation where governments have to react because, of course, they also see that this has an impact even on investments. Now, Oliver, to introduce you, first of all, Oliver Uttersonke is the head of research of the Graduate Institute Center on Conflict Development and Peace Building. He's a member of the Strategic Board of the Swiss Commission for Research Partnership with Developing Countries, and he's an associate member of the Zurich University's Center for Ethics. Oliver teaches the graduate level courses on conflict and development, and his field works take him repeatedly to Madagascar, Rwanda, Timor-Leste, and recently to Colombia. And obviously, the question that emerges from all of this is, first of all, can we actually put the issue of gangs in a uniform way, or are there different types of gangs, or should we actually consider them as different grouping? And also, what are the social and political impacts of this particular armed violence in societies around the world? Thank you all.
Thanks very much, Jamil, for that nice introduction. And first of all, also thank you to Nisa and to Robert Roth and the Geneva Academy for this introduction. As a little word of warning, I might have traveled to Colombia a couple of times, but I'm certainly not a Latin America or Central America expert. So please take this more as comments of a generalist who has thought about armed actors and gangs now for over a decade. But the three countries under focus here, El Salvador, Colombia, and Mexico, are certainly not my neck of the woods when it comes to actual field research. So please bear that in mind when I try and make a few provocative comments, perhaps, to take this to start this discussion. And I actually I'm glad you mentioned this, Jamil. I wanted to maybe perhaps structure my opening remarks around a word of caution on lumping too many phenomena under something called gang violence, or overusing the word gang perhaps for what essentially I think is a variety of different phenomena. And I think partly that has to do with the fact that the word gang has been sensationalized in the public domain. We've romanticized it. We know it from rap culture. We know it from a variety of also positive spins that we give it. And it's also been demonized as being terribly violent, and we all have seen films, City of God and others, that have put a certain type of gang image into our heads. And certainly a lot of that is true. I'm not suggesting gangs and gang violence isn't a terrible thing. But I think if we go back a little bit to the sociology of it and where also the word comes from and how it's been studied, we realize that it might be worth differentiating between quite a few phenomena. So if we go back to the sociology of gangs, if you go back to classic works such as Frederick Thrasher, already in the 1930s, studying gangs in Chicago, what you were essentially looking at were local, often youths, juvenile groups, street corner gangs, who kind of hung out in a certain neighborhood. And often, therefore, it was an urban phenomenon, and it was a phenomenon very much to do with the type of neighborhood you were looking at. This was disenfranchised youths, excluded minorities, marginalized populations. Urban areas were often the state, or at least the public authorities, were more or less absent, or at least weren't there for the people, at least from their perspective. And so often these gangs filled, in a way, that kind of societal function. It gave kids on the street some sort of structure, some sort of safety net, some sort of identity. And in a way, often when we talk of gangs in that kind of classical sense, Boston is another case that's been studied a lot. You're looking at a very specific type of group. This certainly, I think, can also be applied to pandillas, to maras, the way we've been looking at them and the way they've emerged over several decades, especially in Central America. And again, the maras certainly are, and there's various forms and various groups that are lumped under that label, do fit on the one hand that structure, that category of where they come from, how they're embedded within certain neighborhoods, but they've also taken a lot of what they do to a completely new level. So I'm certainly not suggesting that the racketeering, the kidnapping, the extortion, whatever they do isn't reality of how they have been progressing. But I still think it's worth wondering, and this takes me to the first case, to El Salvador, to what extent often what's taken as the transnationalization of the maras phenomenon is really at the heart of what we are looking at there. So you saw in the 1990s, late 1990s, early 2000s, that a lot of what at the time were called mano dura strategies were being implemented. So this was very heavy-handed, securitized, militarized reactions, responses from the government to what was taken to be the problem of gangs, of the maras. Often a lot, I think, had to do with also pressure from not least the United States in terms of, you have to do something about the drug flows and this, that, the other. And we saw that these kind of very heavy-handed security responses didn't necessarily have the effect that people thought they had. Certainly the drugs didn't stop flowing. And I think that is something that already makes us wonder to what extent those maras, those gangs, are really the ones behind the drug cartels, or whether we should perhaps at least make some sort of a differentiation and distinction, even if there are certain linkages. Certainly the maras in the 80s already, or gang members moved, especially to Los Angeles. There was this well documented to how that gang phenomenon moved to the United States. The research, though, is slightly more hesitant in terms of whether we can say that this is all one big structure, and just because there are folks in LA or otherwise that also identify with something called Mara, that they are therefore part of some big transnational kind of organized crime syndicate. At least that's what my colleagues, Dennis Rogers and others who I've been working with on this, they always caution us a little bit to say, well, what is it exactly that's going on here? But what we have certainly seen is that that discourse has been used, not least by certain leaders in the region, as a ticket to get re-elected, sometimes even successfully re-elected, on the idea that we have to do something about these gangs that are behind a lot of insecurity in the region. And I think also the fact that a lot of that uses and continues to use a lot of vocabulary, very militaristic vocabulary of counterinsurgency, that really sounds a lot like winning the hearts and minds a la Afghanistan or Iraq, and where you have elements of the US military establishment, saying that this is the way to go, or even, saying, yay, you've done it the right way in Rio de Janeiro with, counterinsurgency in the favela.
Really worked.
That I think is worrying. And therefore, maybe my first kind of conclusion of my couple of points is perhaps the provocative claim that maybe it's also the very militarized response to a lot of this that has led to situations where we're having an IHL talk about some of these topics here. So I think it's the responses to some of these phenomena that have perhaps also led to a militarization, a securitization of the gang phenomenon. To say a few things about Mexico as well, again, a country I don't know very much about, but that militarization and in a way also using the maras as a scapegoat for a lot of what is happening is something I think that we witness there. It is not by accident that the Mexican police now have anti-Mara intervention battalions, and it's all very militarized, big guns. It's about going out after, again, perhaps a certain part of the population that may or may not be directly involved in the big kind of drug cartel issues that the country is dealing with. So again, the question remains to what extent certain parts of youth populations are becoming the scapegoats for other things, and how perhaps that is a securitized discourse that feeds into what is going on. Again, I'm not suggesting the maras aren't involved. I'm not suggesting that gang violence is something we shouldn't take seriously. And the kind of examples that Jamil also gave, it is a daily reality for a lot of people in the region. But I don't think it's the short-circuited kind of answer to a lot of what we're seeing. And especially if you look at a variety of armed actors that are now also very much present in the Mexican dynamic, we should also talk about this auto-defense forces, self-defense forces, vigilantes groups that sometimes in the media and even by the government are also taken to be under the gang phenomenon. But again, I think that's something quite different. This is again perhaps citizens coming out because they feel the state is not there for them in some way or another, or is part of the wrong response, and that therefore have decided to take community security and urban safety perhaps into their own hands. Again, that's a discussion to be had, whether we think that's the way to go and what are the ethical and legal implications. But again, I'd be cautious to again label that gang violence per se. But perhaps it's a phenomenon that is certainly linked, but it's perhaps worth differentiating this. But what we do finding, I think, what we do see in Colombia is you might have, and the paper that was the basis also of the talk that colleagues from the Geneva Academy wrote, and which is actually well worth reading, they also talk about the BACRIM phenomenon, the bande criminales, the kind of criminal gangs that have been emerging in Guatemala, in Colombia. But again, I think are quite a specific phenomenon, and often they are attributed, not always, but often attributed to, in a way, suboptimal, if not unsuccessful, reintegration programs. So this is often what happens. You do DDR programs, demobilization, disarmament, demobilization, reintegration of former combatants. That reintegration process, as we all know, is a very difficult procedure. It takes a lot of time, takes a lot of acceptance by local communities, and often, in the absence of that working properly, some of these groupings or some of these people reunite in a variety of structures, simply because that's kind of what they've been doing and what they know, and what they know each other, and before you know it, they have turned again into a criminal issue that might certainly have origins out of what was happening in the civil war and the armed groups, but perhaps again is a different phenomenon. So that's really a little bit just a few thoughts on those three country contexts, and how we're trying to make sense of some of this. And I think when we're talking about violence, and I just want to say a few words about that as well, again, we have to ask ourselves, who are the perpetrators of this violence? And is it just simply about very violent groups and individuals, or is it perhaps, and this again might strain certain legal definitions of what we're talking about here, but the kind of structural violence that is involved in having certain groups control certain territory, or at least be active on certain territories, and how we try to encompass that in our integrate that into our analysis of what is going on. Certainly, it's exactly as Jamil said, the fact that I feel I cannot go home, the fact that I have to maybe take a detour because I have to bypass certain neighborhoods. That's also a form of violence done on me as an individual, a citizen living in a certain place. The fact that I feel I cannot move freely, the fact that there are certain armed actors that control or not certain parts of my surroundings, I think is something that we also have to take into account, regardless of whether I am myself personally affected by the physical violence of it all. So in that sense, I plea also to the WHO has a very large definition of what it means, of what it thinks violence is, but I think it is for these kind of discussions also quite useful, because it does say coercion, threats of violence, the psychological aspects of this are also part of what we feel violence is in society, and is something that we need to work with. And then my very last point. In the title, it was called Armed Gang Violence. I have to say something about the armed bit as well, not least because my colleagues here at the Graduate Institute and the Small Arms Survey have been working a lot of this, and as you know, there's also the Geneva Declaration on Armed Violence and Development, which tried to shed light on this through various rounds also of its global burden of armed violence report. Yes, it's a lot about firearms. Yes, it's a lot about guns. It's a lot about guns in society and ammunition being spread in a variety of ways. And actually, to come back to the real example, I remember years ago already the Small Arms Survey came with evidence showing that some of the ammunition used by gangs in favelas was actually from police stockpiles who had therefore they had sold the ammunition to the gangs who were then shooting back with it. So this is in and of itself, I think, a very tricky subject. But I think beyond that, the idea that they're all armed with guns in and of itself, again, I think doesn't capture the whole spectrum of what it is we're talking about. There is lots of sexual and gender-based violence. There's lots of domestic violence in certain areas. Again, some of it can be attributed to gang activity and others cannot. But I think there, again, it's worth opening the box in terms of what we mean by violence, and whether it's so easy to have the gang as the scapegoat on one side, and then very militarized responses by the state and others on the other. But I think I'll leave it there, Jamil, for the time being, and then see what others say.
Thank you, Oliver. Thank you for opening the box, as you said. That is a very good introduction, so we can actually jump in the legal aspect of all of this and try to understand what it means. And for that, I'm going to ask Gloria Gaggioli, if I'm not wrong. She's the assistant professor at the University of Geneva, faculty member at the Geneva Academy of International Humanitarian Law and Human Rights. Her work focuses in particular on issues related to the interplay between international humanitarian law and international human rights, the right to life, and the use of force. Before joining the University of Geneva, she served as legal advisor at the ICRC. So basically, Oliver opened the box, but this is a complex box, it looks like. As a legal expert, what would be the applicable legal framework to look at this phenomenon?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Oliver. It's indeed Jamil, sorry. It's indeed a very complex issue. It's a complex issue, first of all, for the population. I think, Jamil, you gave an example at the beginning, which showed that for every citizen, it's an issue when you are afraid about tomorrow. So that's the first complexity. But the second complexity is also for states. I think we need to recognize that states are facing situations which are quite exceptional. On one hand, they have a duty to protect their population against murders, against acts of torture, against human trafficking, etc. So there is a duty for the state to react. But at the same time, this duty is encompassed in international law. So they have to react, but at the same time they need to respect the international standards that are applicable in such situations. And this leads me to the third complexity, which is the legal complexity that I will be addressing today. So the question you asked me, Jamie, is quite broad. It's about the applicable legal frameworks. So the first applicable legal framework is obviously domestic law, but I won't focus on that. As an international lawyer, I will rather focus on the international legal frameworks which are applicable to gang violence. And when we think about gang violence, there are mainly two international applicable legal frameworks. These are international human rights law, but also in some extreme circumstances, it might also be international humanitarian law. This is why we are talking about that in the IHL Talks, precisely. And so therefore, we could find also a third international legal applicable framework, which might even be international criminal law in certain situations. So I will somehow rephrase the question, if you allow me to do so, and tackle directly the elephant in the room, which is, can gang violence amount to an armed conflict in certain situations? And I would start by saying that actually gang violence is not defined in international law. So we are trying to cope with a phenomenon which is without any definition. So for the purpose of our discussion, I will define gang violence as acts of violence which are perpetrated by armed groups which are more or less organized depending on the situation. And I think, Oliver, you explained that there are many types of armed groups, of armed gangs, and they are not all structured and operating in the same manner. And the particularity is that they engage in criminal activities. This is their main purpose: drug trafficking, human trafficking, etc. And they do not have political motives, political motivations. They do not want to overthrow the government. They do not want to create a new state. And so if we take such a broad definition, we can see that many countries are actually plagued by armed gangs. I mean, even if I take Italy, think about the mafia, I mean, they are facing gang violence. So we do not need to go to Latin America to find gang violence. There is this everywhere in the world. But as we said, all these gang violence situations are not all the same. We have different types of groups and different types of violence. So actually, I will try to divide three broad situations and see what are the legal frameworks in these three broad situations. A first broad situation is, in my view, the vast majority of cases. In most cases, gang violence does not amount to an armed conflict. It's what the ICSC calls another situation of violence. It's internal strife, internal disturbances, which might implicate many murders, many killings, many atrocious acts, but which not necessarily amount to an armed conflict. Why they do not amount to an armed conflict in this first broad situation? First, because it might be that the gang is not sufficiently organized. You have anarchical groups operating in the country. And so they are not organized armed groups for the purpose of international humanitarian law. And then you have isolated, sporadic acts of violence, if I borrow the terminology used by Additional Protocol 2 to the Geneva Conventions, Article 1, Paragraph 2. So these acts of violence exist, but they are not coordinated in any sense. In such a situation, the main international legal framework that is applicable is international human rights law. Now, I would like to highlight that it's not because international human rights law applies that states cannot react in a manner that is efficient and in a manner which allows to protect the population. Having human rights obligations does not tie the hands of states. They have many opportunities to respond in a lawful manner. So of course there are red lines under human rights law. You might not murder members of armed gangs, so targeted killings are out of the spectrum of possible options. You may not torture them, you may not convict them without a fair trial. But I would say that most of these aspects, not all, most of them apply also in armed conflict situations. then human rights law is complex enough to offer possibilities for states to respond to such difficult situations. Most human rights are not absolute, meaning that you can limit some rights in order to cope with such situations of violence. It's absolutely possible and even a duty to arrest members of armed gangs, to prosecute them with a fair trial, and to prevent them from harming the population. Additionally, states might even have the right to derogate to some of their obligations, meaning to suspend some of their human rights obligations. Of course, they need to follow a procedure that we might all know. Let's look at the Human Rights Committee General Comment number 29, specifying the conditions. So you need to notify, to proclaim the state of emergency. But we can say that gang violence is a public emergency and that states have also this option, which from a purely human rights perspective might be even a little bit worrying, because we might fall in what Theodore Meron called a gap. It's the famous Meron gap, saying that in such situations, if the states derogate from their human rights obligations, you have less human rights, but nevertheless you do not have IHL because the conditions, the criteria for the application of IHL are not there. So you have less international legal obligations, which might be as such an issue, but which is less and less so because states, as you may know, do not like to derogate because they do not want the attention of people like you, Jamil, of the media. They do not want to attract the attention of special rapporteurs of the human rights community, etc. Now, regarding the use of force in such a situation, the use of force against members of armed gangs, is obviously even possible under human rights law. That's what I would propose to call the law enforcement paradigm, meaning that yes, obviously you can use force and even potentially or intentionally deadly force against criminals. But this possibility is restricted by many principles. So the first principle is the principle of absolute necessity. So the use of deadly force, for instance, against a member of an armed gang, must be the ultima ratio, so the last resort. So first you need to try to find another solution, to try to arrest those people and to use, if possible in the situation, less than lethal means. For instance, using rubber bullets, water cannons, etc. So as far as possible, law enforcement officials must use a graduated use of force and must make sure that the force that is being used is strictly proportionate. But this does not mean at all that law enforcement officials, the police, the military cannot respond under a peacetime regime to these situations of violence. Of course, targeted killing, as I said before, it's not a law enforcement method. Intentional killing in peacetime is not completely impossible, but if you follow, for instance, the UN basic principles on the use of force and firearms, they say that it must be strictly unavoidable. Strictly unavoidable implicates that you need to be in a situation of self-defense, so you have an imminent threat to life, and that no other options are available. So it's really in really rare cases that this would happen. So this is my first part, that in most cases it's human rights law with all the restrictions are implied, but which do not imply that states cannot respond. Now you have a second type of broad situations. Let's take, for instance, the situation in Afghanistan, where you had the Taliban, an armed group, as we know, which was fighting against the government and the US and the coalitions, notably the ISAF. Now, the Taliban is an armed group, but in order to finance their activities, they had to somehow collaborate with gangs, especially in the trade of opium. So actually here you have a situation which is quite different, because the basis is that you have an armed conflict situation. And then in addition to this armed conflict situation, you have gang violence. So that's quite intricate, because actually you have the superposition of two different international legal frameworks. The first being international humanitarian law, and the second is human rights law, which continues to apply. So in such situations, it's not because you have an armed conflict situation on the ground that suddenly everything is covered by international humanitarian law. International humanitarian law is a body of law which is much more permissive than human rights law. For instance, take detention. Security detention, so without fair trials of individuals in relation to the armed conflict, is totally normal and feasible in armed conflict under IHL, which would not be acceptable under human rights law in peacetime. Then you have the use of force. So the use of force under IHL is not governed by the famous law enforcement paradigm that I just described, but rather by conduct of hostilities rules, meaning that as soon as you are confronted with a legitimate target, this person can be targeted and killed. You might even have collateral damages among the civilian population. So an opportunity to use force which is much more strong than under human rights law. So the paradigm is quite different. But this conduct of hostilities paradigm does not apply to all situations of violence inside an armed conflict. So for instance, if you take the fight against the Taliban, irrespective of their trading of opium, they are an armed group, so all the members of the Taliban group who have what the ICSE calls a continuous combat function, whose job it is to take part in the hostilities all the time, then these persons are legitimate targets. And you apply IHL, the conduct of hostilities paradigm. But when it comes to armed gangs operating in Afghanistan, you might be surprised, but these people are civilians. So for the purpose of IHL, they are protected as civilians, meaning that they cannot be targeted and killed like the Taliban. Force may be used against them, but under a law enforcement paradigm, meaning under human rights law. And even the mere fact of having links, the armed gangs having links with the Taliban, with an armed group, is not sufficient to say, well, they are like the Taliban, okay? So it does not, the collaboration, the economic collaboration between armed groups and armed gangs does not mean that they are exactly the same entity. So here you have a situation where you need to distinguish depending on the situation of violence inside an armed conflict situation. Now, finally, that's my third category. I would say that in rare situations, it might happen that gang violence itself might reach the threshold of an armed conflict situation. This is not the rule, but rather the exception. However, it remains entirely true that under international humanitarian law, nothing prevents to consider armed gangs, gang violence, as part of an armed conflict in and of itself. Why is it so? It is so because international humanitarian law is a pragmatic body of law. It is a body of law which focuses on facts on the ground, on objective facts that you can verify. And for instance, trying to find what are the motives of gangs is not something IHL does. So basically, states accepted, it took a long time, but they accepted to regulate civil wars, non-international armed conflicts, by international humanitarian law rules. You have, for instance, in the 4 Geneva Conventions, Common Article 3, which it's a very short article about fundamental guarantees, but it deals with non-international armed conflicts, including civil wars. Then you have additional Protocol 2 to the Geneva Conventions, which complement this, and obviously for international lawyers, you know that customary law continues to apply for such situations. So states accepted to have rules for these type of situations, but they did not want to cover all type of internal violence. So they made a clear distinction between internal strife and armed conflicts. And this has been done based on 2 criteria, which, it is true, are not clearly written in the Geneva Conventions and additional protocols, but at least the majority view among international lawyers is that in order to have a non-international armed conflict, you need to have first an organized armed group, and second, a sufficient intensity of violence. Now, regarding organization, the ICTY case law has devised certain numbers of factors in order to know what is really an organized armed group. So, for instance, you need to look at the command structure of the group, whether the group has a unified military strategy, whether the group has a level of logistics which allows them to recruit and to provide weapons to their members. They need to have disciplinary rules to make sure that there is a certain kind of discipline inside the group, and that ideally the group would be able to make sure that IHL is respected, and the group needs to be able to speak with one voice, so communication is key there. Regarding intensity, you also have a certain number of factors, but probably the most important one is that when we think about an armed conflict, we think about armed clashes. So basically you have the governmental armed forces fighting against an organized armed group. So it's not just extrajudicial killings, it's confrontation. So it's a very particular type of armed violence. Usually we also look at temporal and geographical factors. So how long does these kind of confrontations last? Where do they take place? The type of weapons used, the number of casualties, etc. So now if you take those criteria and you compare this with what you've read in the war report, you can see that at least in some cases, we cannot rule out that some of these gangs correspond to organized armed groups. I mean, they are able to find weapons, war weapons. They are able to train their people with that. They're able maybe not to control territory, but almost. So, I mean, they look a lot like an armed group. On the other hand, you see that the response by states very often does not look like a graduated use of force under law enforcement. But it looks like a war reaction. And so it's the combination between the two which might give rise to a non-international armed conflict and therefore to the application of international humanitarian law. And also, if serious violations of this body of law exist, then you have war crimes. Now, why don't we add another criterion, like the motive of the group? Because usually this is the argument which is made. It's to say, well, this is a different type of violence. It should never amount to an armed conflicts because these groups, they do not have political motives. They just are there for criminal purposes. And states did not want to have that. If you look at the travaux préparatoires of the 4 Geneva Conventions, it was part of the discussion, and clearly states did not want to have this third criterion. Why not? Because in practice, how do you know the motives of each and every group? So it's very difficult to find the motivations, and also to determine between various motivations which one should prevail. A second reason is that it's opening a door. So if you start looking at motivations, then it means that some other groups might not be considered as armed group, and somehow you have an escape from a possible escape from states to respect their obligations under international humanitarian law. So when gang violence is really organized and reaches a quite high threshold of violence, and when the state reaction is also reaching a high threshold of violence, then yes, IHL applies. Now, as a final comment, I would say that obviously nothing impedes states to say, despite the fact that on my territory I have an organized armed group, I prefer to stick with law enforcement. And so I prefer to employ law enforcement means. Then please go ahead. Why? Because it means that you have more restrictive rules under the conduct of under the law enforcement, under human rights law, and you have more restrictive rules under detention. But the problem is when you have a pick and choose approach, meaning that you have a warlike reaction by states, and at the same time the denial of the application of international humanitarian law. On the other hand, I think that over-application of humanitarian law is as dangerous as refusing the application of humanitarian law. So I wouldn't like you to go out of the room and to think each time there is a gang, then it's an armed conflict. No. It's quite the opposite. Usually it's not an armed conflict, but in some cases it might reach the level of an armed conflict. Thank you for your attention.
Fantastic. Thank you, Gloria. Oliver opened the box. You made it very complex. I'm sure it actually does answer a lot of the questions, even for the case of Brazil that I mentioned. And now, actually, I would like to introduce to all of you Cecilia Jimenez Damari. She is the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights of Internally Displaced Persons, and she was named by the Human Rights Council in September 2016. She is a human rights lawyer specialist in forced displacement and migrations. For over 2 decades, she had experience with NGOs, advocacy in Asia-Pacific region. And she is also the government representative to the Philippines Transitional Justice and Reconciliation Commission. And she just came back from El Salvador. I didn't want to mention that.
You may.
Cecilia, please tell us a little bit of the impact of this complex situation basically in lives of persons, displacement especially, the possibility of movement, and actually what that means in terms of the right to life as well. Also, if you could bring us some information from El Salvador, and that would also enrich our conversation. And after that, I'm going to open to all of you. Remember, this is being taped, and there's a journalist in the room, but feel free to speak.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you very much to the Graduate Institute for this invitation. I just came down from Basel, and so came directly here to be with you. So it's really very much a privilege. First, let me say a few words about my United Nations mandate on the human rights of internally displaced persons. It's quite a mouthful, but I take my guidance really at the primary level from the human rights standards relating to those who have to flee their homes but remain within the borders of their countries. In particular, the UN Guiding Principles on Internal Displacement, which was adopted in 1998, establishes that internal displacement can be caused by factors including conflict, natural disasters, development projects, and most significantly, within the context of our conversation today, as a result of generalized violence. So let me focus on the effects, as Jamil has kindly suggested to me. Now, while many people associate internal displacement mostly with conflict, I'm very happy that we have a legal expert here who have already described this complexity. I'm not going into that. But I think it's very important to recognize that governments have, first of all, an obligation to prevent displacement as a result of such generalized violence and to protect the human rights of those IDPs, whether or not they remain within the context on the field of human rights and or international humanitarian law. In other words, a country does not have to have camps and evacuation centers that we immediately think about when we talk about IDPs. They don't have to have camps and evacuation centers to establish that internally displacement exists. We have to have internally displaced persons who may not at all be in the camps. Now, yes, we were in El Salvador last August, and during my visit there, I was really informed of the devastating and extraordinary impact of generalized and particularly gang-related violence on individuals, families, communities. Gangs may control with weapons, with violence. They may dominate territories and populations through threats, intimidation, and the culture of violence infects the whole communities, people's everyday lives. What I can say is that the peoples are really affected. The mere fact that your friend, Jamil, could not get out at least once a week is already something that is very alarming in any case. But what more if it is a consistent application of that cultural violence, because then activities, movements, interactions, relationships are all affected. Killings have become commonplace, as we know. Extortion of individuals and small businesses are also commonplace, and they are seen to be attacks by the gangs or local communities. Community members have described to me in many of my interviews not being unable to let their children out to play for fear that they would fall under the influence or be threatened by the gang members and be recruited into the gangs as well. With individuals under threat from the gangs, I was informed, therefore, that they or their whole families would simply disappear, leaving their homes abandoned or selling them as cheaply as they could. And so in some of my visits to the communities, you would see actually abandoned homes. And actually this is also the case with some findings I did not do, but which is really in the literature in Mexico, which is also one of the countries being discussed here. I was also informed that young people really cannot lead normal lives. Young adolescents, like most of the people who are here. One young adult told me it is a crime to be a young person in El Salvador today. This is a very deeply depressing statement that I heard many times in different variations during my visit, including from senior public officials. Let me also tell you about young women and girls. They are particularly vulnerable to threats, intimidation, and violence, including rape, and the highest levels of femicide have been recorded in many of these places. Women whom I met, some in secret safe houses or shelters, described to me their experiences of threats and violence by gang members, leading them to flee their homes with their children or in fear of that their lives will be threatened, and also to protect their children. We had to go to some of those secret safe houses because they are not recorded anywhere. They were not government safe houses at all. We had to ensure that our mobile phones would be turned off because we would not want to be in any position to be tracked by either the gangs, who are also sophisticated in surveillance, or the security forces. One of the women whom we met with her family in one of these shelters informed me that she refused to help a gang commit a kidnapping, and therefore she was raped and then she was forced to flee. Also, members of LGBTI community, particularly transgender women, are also highly vulnerable to such violence. I met some who described to me being forced to flee their homes several times, to threats, assassination attempts, and intimidation by gangs as well as members of the police or the military. One such transgender woman I met was actually had about 20 bullets already. She already suffered from 20 bullet wounds. Fortunately, she's still alive, and she continues to fight for the rights of LGBTI community in El Salvador. And she is continuously, of course, threatened by both the gangs and by, unfortunately, also allegations from by the police or the military. She actually was a candidate in the Martin Ennals Award, which you might know is a very prestigious human rights award. In a kindergarten that I visited, there were loads of kids who were very happy within locked four walls of a school. I was shown the pictures made by the young children who responded to the question, "What do you fear?" And in those very beautiful, stark, colored pictures, they depicted men with guns and masks and families leaving their homes. Very, very stark. When asked what they wanted for the future, those whom I interviewed described their hopes for a normal life of safe neighborhoods, secure streets, just to be able to play outside in the streets. Because going to school by itself is a problem, because the threat comes from one side or the other. And this is a life, therefore, that families usually aspire for, a life without threat of gang violence or an oppressive police and military presence. While the community members told me that they felt that not enough is being done to tackle the violence and establish the rule of law, they also noted that they also fear the police and armed forces when they come into the communities. That's merely a slice of the reality which I saw in El Salvador. And my predecessor, Professor Chaloca Biani, also went to Honduras the year before, and he had more or less the same findings. And I think it's very important to also see the commonalities of the situation in those countries. For the Honduras report is already out for reading. It was presented to the UN Human Rights Council last year, so that might also be very helpful in your analysis at the Graduate Institute. And also the El Salvador report, based on the visit that I made last August, will be presented this June in 2018 before the Human Rights Council. So I invite you to also consult that report when it comes out. Mexico has not been visited yet by the special rapporteur by my mandate. I have asked for a visit to Mexico. But what I can say is that I went to Mexico last August as well, after El Salvador, and attended an internal displacement conference convened by the National Human Rights Institution of Mexico for 2 days. And there it was the Mexicans themselves who were telling everybody in the room, including myself, what the reality in Mexico is. And so I hope that I will be able to receive a positive acceptance by the government of Mexico to my request for a visit to look at the plight of internal displacement there. Now, I was very happy when Gloria, and of course with Oliver opening the box and Gloria looking at all these legal issues. I'm a human rights lawyer myself, and of course also looking into international humanitarian law. But I must say it is really, really very complex. And Gloria has already given you a very in-depth, detailed analysis of when IHL, because it is an IHL talk, may apply or may not apply. Now, if, the big if, as Gloria has managed to convey to all of us, if IHL does apply, and I will not say, I cannot say if IHL does apply to those countries that the mandate has visited, but if IHL does apply, then it is obvious to start on the issue of prevention. I actually shared this with the ICRC in a seminar under chapter rules that they actually convened about 2 weeks ago. And I thought it was very important that when they were talking about the war in cities, an application of IHL, and they also looked at the issue of violence, including those perpetrated by gangs or related organizations like gangs. So if IHL principles, actually I pose more questions than anything, can IHL with its current principles actually prevent the harm to the civilians that push civilians to flee from danger? Because my mandate is looking at the effect on the civilians themselves. And I think that we all know that in many displacement situations, despite or because of the actual operationalization of precaution and proportionality, and or simply the non-adaptability of traditional weaponry, particularly to urban settings of war, displacement has become a norm. So this is, of course, a theoretical question, but it is also important to look at its application if that is the condition, those are the conditions. Would the concept under IHL and the issue of prevention, would the concept of arbitrary displacement embrace situations where internal displacement could have been prevented if IHL had been implemented with more respect? It's a question. In actual terms, the flight of civilian populations is a defensive reaction. It is actually the application of the freedom of movement to protect themselves and their families. And it is obvious that the protective capacity of authorities and also, of course, the gangs who already control the territory it's not effective at all. So these are questions I actually would like to throw to the audience here. But at the very, very minimum, of course, it's human rights that would apply in the broad terms that Gloria have already shared with us. And so, therefore, I go back to the guiding principles of internal displacement, which you know is considered soft law. It's a combination of international human rights law and IHL principles as well. And at the same time, many of its provisions can already be considered as use cogents. Torture, for example. You don't even have to say soft law, it's use cogents. But also treaty law, particularly for those countries that have ratified those relevant international treaties. And guiding principles provide very, very clear principles on prevention and protection. Now, the true number of those affected by internal displacement in such conditions, context that we're talking about today, is very much hidden, as victims seek anonymity, because if they are disclosed, then they would be further vulnerable and open to violence from one or the other groups in the country and from which they have flown for. And for some, of course, as we know, these are Latin American countries that we're talking about. Well, Colombia, I haven't really visited yet. We know Mexico and El Salvador. But we know that these are countries that are also within the context of migration outside of their borders. Now, statistical data and further independent research is therefore very vital to reveal the full extent of the problem of internal displacement in these countries. And actually, I very much appreciate, for example, the government of Honduras. And I went to Honduras, I think 1 month ago, to attend a regional conference, and I was able to meet the state minister of Honduras, and he was very, very much open in saying that yes, as we know, they have already acknowledged, the government of El Salvador had already acknowledged internal displacement does exist, and they have been really trying to apply many of the principles of the guiding principles and coming up with the law and mechanisms that would help prevent internal displacement and protect the IDPs. So that is the very, very first thing that really must be done by the governments themselves, even without waiting for the full extent, because the acknowledgement by the states is very important in order to put conditions towards those research and the protective capacity of the state. It's clear to me that the phenomenon of internal displacement caused by generalized and gang-related violence is significant and largely unrecognized in some of these countries. Honduras is, of course, the laudable exception. And this crisis really affects thousands of individuals, families, and whole communities. As mentioned to you, the guiding principles on internal displacement are the key international human rights standards relating to internal displacement, and they are clearly it's clearly that they are the obligations of the governments to include effective mechanisms and responses to prevent and, of course, address appropriately internal displacement caused by generalized violence, regardless of what international human rights or international humanitarian law, regardless of which of these two apply. The guiding principles and other international human rights laws, standards, IHL, these are all relevant, and they do provide important guidance to the government on measures to protect those affected by internal displacement. My time is almost up, but I would like to take this opportunity as well to share with you that in treating these conditions of internal displacement and the plight of internally displaced persons in many of these countries, actually we have a very interesting year coming up in 2018, because it is the 20th anniversary of the guiding principles on internal displacement, and I think that many stakeholders, particularly at the national level, we are now encouraging them to actually step up their responses in order to ensure that we use 2018 to have a sustainable approach to the protection of IDPs, regardless of what law applies. So thank you very much.
Fantastic. We are very lucky to have all these three panelists with various views on a very complex issue, and it makes the debate very rich. I will open to the questions from all of you. We have 30 minutes. Please introduce yourselves. Questions to anyone here, obviously to the three of them. No. Please, go ahead. That includes you, Gabriela. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Silvia Gastelum. I work for the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. The project I'm working on, it's about community responses to organized crime and violence. And what we've been doing for the last 2 years is looking at how communities at the local level are responding to organized crime and violence. And our work is not only to research these local practices that could be, better useful to understand how our community is responding to violence and organized crime, but also to incubate, support these initiatives at the local level. So my question, we started in Mexico, and our project is planning to move on to Central America, looking at community responses to extortion, and hopefully also South Africa and the Philippines. My question for the three panelists would be if you are aware of community responses to gun violence, and I would love to hear more examples about that. So, thank you.
Who wants to begin?
Yeah, I think
yes, Cecilia.
Thank you very much. That's a very relevant question, particularly when it comes to internally displaced persons. We actually start protection at the local level, and so I'm very happy about learning about your global initiative. And when I visited El Salvador, and it is actually in my exit statement, I found that the people actually cope on a day-to-day basis, and they organize themselves in order to protect themselves. One particular example is my visit to this kindergarten, which is actually a private school that's funded by the families themselves with a little help from other donors. And I was talking to the mothers there, and they were telling me that they have organized themselves in order to ensure that their children are safe in the streets. Although when I asked them, so what is the first thing that you would like to have? And they immediately told me, oh, we would like to have the walls higher. When the thing that I was asking for is in order to have a medium-term or long-term sustainable approach for the future of their children. But that is how they're coping in the very first instance, and that is to think immediately of the safety now and here, and not then and there. So I think it's important to acknowledge this, but at the same time, this is where also governments and other NGOs and the international agencies that are actually working there at the ground to be able to extend support in all of these, because obviously the violence can come from anywhere, but I think that the protective capacity of the state in these contexts have to be really taken more seriously by the state itself and its entities. And I think just very quickly, I think that with regard to medium and long term, they were a lot of them were very much aware of the fact that there may be some legislative initiatives, even though they're not involved in it, of protection for them that may be given by law. So I'm actually bringing this up also in response, because even though it's not the community who's responding, but the community is not ignorant of what's happening in the country. In fact, the draft law that is now being considered is actually one of the interesting issues that they have been discussing. But also, secondly, it is a very good approach to ensure that there is a legal framework to respond to whatever situation there is in this particular case in these countries. Mexico, the Human Rights Commission of Mexico has in fact is in fact proposing a federal law for the protection of internally displaced persons, and we have just gotten a draft from them, and we will be giving technical advice as to what the strengths that can be actually helpful for their situation.
Oliver, do you want to jump in?
Thank you, Jamil. Yeah, also just very briefly on, thank you for the question. It's good to see you here. We work a lot with your colleagues, Tuesday Retana and others, on a variety of things also related to our Geneva Peacebuilding platform here, at which you come to a lot of our events. And I mean, what springs to mind, actually, given that we're talking El Salvador here, is we had last year we had the case. We actually brought the lady here of a mother from a neighborhood there who lost her son in a gang fight, and who said enough is enough, and apparently went and found the mothers of the other gang, and literally the mum sorted it out, in the sense that they managed to get to have some sort of a gang truce in the neighborhood, where you really saw the power often of people, and especially women in these kind of neighborhoods. It is a great story. I'm always a little bit hesitant to champion it as the blueprint because for a specific neighborhood it might have worked. It doesn't mean it'll work in the next neighborhood. But I think it's certainly, we also need to find those kind of positive success stories of individuals who had the courage to do something about it. Another example that I do want to mention, also because it relates to what you were saying about prevention and the linkages with peace building that we've been having here over the last few years as well, and specifically this year, where the Geneva Peacebuilding Platform focused on prevention, is also how we relate it to the actual physical space. Yes. So a lot of work we've been doing also regarding UN Habitat and its new urban agenda is also really to say, well, we need peaceful and inclusive public space. So how do we get that? And in San Salvador, there, again, to continue with that example, there have been instances where we're really trying to think about how to make the parks a safe space for people to mingle, and not where you get mugged at night and where you can't enter. So I think it's a matter of, you mentioned it, the higher walls. Part of the problem also is this, what one African scholar nicely calls this architecture of fear that we end up having in a lot of these cities, where half of us are in gated communities and have lots of barbed wire, and you mentioned private security and living in that kind of a bubble. Yeah. And then obviously it's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy, so there must be lots of violence and stuff happening on the other side of that wall, otherwise why would I have the wall and the private security in the first place? But what you have is, you do not have meaningful public space anymore. You have even private roads and private flyovers, so that I get from my gated community to my golf course to my shopping mall. But the idea of having inclusive public space, I think, is lost. And I was, also with our own research at the moment, champion ideas where we're trying to get urban planners, urban designers, architects involved in these kind of discussions. Because often I find that us doing armed violence prevention, reduction, peace building don't necessarily reach out to those communities, nor do they necessarily think about their role in preventing and reducing violence. So I'm glad you brought that up. Thank you.
Gloria.
Yeah, I think we are all on the same page on this issue. I think that it's great from a short-term perspective, and it's definitely a fix and something that we need to work on. So the work of your organization is tremendously important. Now, from a broader perspective, it is the role of the state to protect. I was talking about the duty to protect. This flows from concrete human rights, like the right to life, and so states should not have the impression that solutions will be found at the community level, because at the same time they need to be strong enough to maintain law and order on the territory they control. And especially regarding the use of force, but I'm sure you were not talking about that. But we could have also the problem of the decentralization of the use of force. If communities have the impression that the police or the military people are not able to maintain law and order, they might be tempted to create what you were calling, Oliver, self-defense groups. And there, it's the beginning of the end somehow, because you have a multiplication of violence rather than a decrease.
Yes, I think you have the example in Mexico of the self-armed militias that are fighting in their villages or towns against, the cartels. But then, how do you regulate and some of them actually become other cartel? So
exactly.
Yes, it is definitely a risk. Thank you.
Thank you. Someone else? Yes, please.
Thank you for your interventions. My name is Irene. I am now studying at the Master in Transitional Justice at the Geneva Academy. And I'm gonna make a question that probably will be my thesis question, so that's my thesis, but I'm wondering if it's possible. But I've worked in Guatemala and in Mexico, especially in Mexico in Guerrero, which is one of the states more affected by the narcos, and also where a lot of community responses are being developed to this. And I was wondering, since in Mexico they call it the war against the narco, if transitional justice can go out of the rigid scheme that we think from going to a dictatorship to a democracy, and if transitional justice can be applied to this kind of non-traditional conflict, which involves a lot of complex things and which is not clear-cut. But yes, I was wondering that, if I need to make a thesis.
It's interesting you mentioned this, because I'm in the process of generating a larger research project with colleagues here from the Geneva Academy, with Frank Haldeman and Thomas Unger and other on these kind of issues. So I think you should definitely talk to them more about what you could do for your thesis. I think certainly transitional justice isn't just for the real post-conflict type of setting. Certainly is also coming up, for instance, in post-authoritarian, it always has, but a prime case today is Tunisia, where again we're talking about, and it's been enshrined in some of the commissions that came out also with the constitutional reform in 2014, to what extent transitional justice mechanisms are part of that setting. And I think in Colombia as well, it's very interesting to see how and to what extent transitional justice does play a role. And my own little kind of hobby horse here that I always push, because also my interest lies in security sector reform and in police reform, is to what extent in those settings you also focus on state institutions and state security organizations, and not just the FARC and not just the rebel groups or whoever it might be. Because often, and again we're seeing this now in Colombia, when people think transitional justice, they think the FARC. And not necessarily a lot of the other actors that have been, because it's very sensitive and it's perhaps not what certain governments are wishing to engage with. And often I find when you look at the UN has 4 pillars of transitional justice. If you look at the 4th pillar on the guarantees of non-recurrence, it's about institutional reform. And for me, this is where security sector reform squarely fits in. This is where we should talk police reform. And this is where we're also having issues where often the vetting of police officers who played a variety of roles, and other security agents obviously during times of conflict or during times of authoritarianism, aren't necessarily captured by these processes. We saw this in Cambodia, we saw this in South Africa, we saw this in East Timor, where again the Police Nacional of Timor, the National Police of Timor-Leste, is full of people who were also police officers under the Indonesian occupation. Simply because you needed to have a police force that still functions. So often that's, I think, where certain shortcuts in the transitional justice process are made, and where certainly the angle of transitional justice, that optic, does allow one to pose certain questions. It doesn't necessarily give you the answers, but it does remind us of certain reform issues that, especially in the security sector, that often plague for a long time these kind of contexts.
Excellent. Actually, Oliver touched on a very good point on transitional justice, which is the fact that you actually put questions when you do the work, and not always you have an answer. At the Truth Commission in Brazil, at least, we did a research that took 2 years. There was not a single case that was brought to justice after that, but the questions were put. So perhaps this is a way forward.
Jen,
yes,
just
yes,
jump
sorry.
quickly. I think I was also introduced, because you introduced me before this panel as having been a former member,
yes.
Government representative to the Transitional Justice Reconciliation Commission in the Philippines. So I will take that privilege, but I just have to say, first of all, that as we all know, just to reconfirm, the transitional justice applies not only to post-conflict, but also to post-authoritarian regimes or those in transition. So I think that question has already been more or less accepted. And in fact, I just came this morning from Basel, as I mentioned, because yesterday I co-convened with Swiss Peace, which is a very strong transitional justice research program. I co-convened with them an expert workshop on transitional justice and internal displacement. And we had researchers from all over the world who presented their papers and abstracts and papers that will hopefully also feed into my report on transitional justice and IDPs that I will be presenting to the UN General Assembly end of next year. So that's just a preview that I wanted to inform you. But in any case, I think that, as Oliver had said and Jamid, transitional justice can be used as an optic and as a tool to ask the right questions. Because the beauty of transitional justice for me, and the work that I have been doing, particularly in Asia, is also it provides us certain pathways that cannot necessarily be addressed by other regimes that are too general, etc. Because TJ can be a practical tool if we think about it, but also the limitation there is that it will have to be on the context-to-context application. So, but there is promise in TJ with regard to certain issues that are post-authoritarian. And in fact, coming from a country where lots of murders are happening, this is also a question that we are posing ourselves as transitional justice advocates.
Excellent. Yes, sir. Go ahead.
Graham Fox, working with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. I declare an interest, I support the work of the I was very struck, thank you for all the presentations, I was very struck thinking about some of Oliver's comments about understanding the gangs and that sometimes there's a misrepresentation. I've been interested to see that actually going to root causes and solutions, the need to understand that actually this is often born out of poverty, for example, and the fact that many gang members frequently are living insecure, poverty-ridden lives with a very small income gained from their criminal activities. And you know, I think in looking at solutions, how we must get under the skin of what the gangs are in practice. They're not all part of big multinational organizations with multi-million dollar incomes. So I'm also struck by this tension then of how we find solutions, because it's also been noted that the governments have an obligation to protect communities. They've sometimes done that in a rather heavy-handed way, which actually has been seen to exacerbate problems. So on one side we have this obligation for a security protection response. On the other hand, we also have an obligation towards a socio-economic development solution which recognises that gangs and gang members are also born of poverty and to some extent, in some situations, also victims themselves. And so I'd be very interested in your reflections about how we deal with that tension somehow between, it seems to me that the strong security response almost closes the space to some extent for the other socio-economic responses. You talked about building the space, community space, etc. And just in terms of framing solutions, how do we address that tension?
With you, Ollie.
Thank you for that question. Indeed, I think it's worth thinking about a little bit the kind of the portfolio of responses one has. And we, back in the day, together with Dennis Rogers and Rob Mugger and others, we started thinking about what, at least in Central American terms, we called second generation responses to reducing and preventing armed violence that goes beyond the kind of heavy-handed mano dura responses. And this can take a variety of forms, This can be anything from community policing to awareness-raising programs to civilian arms control initiatives to using public space, working with education in schools. So it really is the whole portfolio, if you like, of things that one can do within the community. And I think the tension you rightly raise is not so much to do with the efficacy or not of those measures, but it's to what extent they are able to do what they could be doing within a very securitized government discourse or international discourse that pulls everything in another direction, that pulls towards more procurement, that talks about bigger guns for police services, that looks at a militarization of security services. You mentioned it as well, armed forces versus the police. Why on earth would I want soldiers of the armed forces on my streets? That's not what they're there for. According to at least my 101 security sector governance, it's the army is for external security, and there is, police and public orders is there for internal security. And the fact that you've, in Mexico and elsewhere, you have, or in lots of places around the world, you have lots of military on the streets already makes you wonder what on earth is going on there. So for me, that is part of the problem, that there is an internationalized discourse around insurgency, very much also linked now to terrorism. The two are often very nicely conflated into all kinds of things, and is often also a way for certain governments, certain regimes to finance themselves, their activities, their forces, and that I think is very much at loggerheads with the kind of community responses that you have. And then you just go to a favela in Rio and you see exactly this. On the one hand, you have all these community things and lots of grassroots initiatives and lots of civil society organizations, and then you have Bope and others, you have a top-down kind of federal idea that then comes in and says, no, we need to come with counterinsurgency tactics and armored personnel carriers in order to occupy, invade, liberate the neighborhood. And I think that's part of the issue here, is that there are a variety of different policy frameworks that don't necessarily all work in the same direction, and that's where I would at least always put the onus also on accountability from the state side. And we know our colleagues here from the Geneva, from DCAF, the International Center on the Democratic Control of Armed Forces, that's what they will tell you all day long. It's about parliamentary oversight, it's about accountability of security services and the justice system, because all of that is part of security sector governance. And on the one hand saying, yes, you need strong state institutions, but you also need them in such a way that they are accountable to their populations. And it's only then also that the kind of community building and community responses can have the desired effect. And I think that's exactly that tension that you rightly observed.
No, thank you very much, I think, for your comment. I think it's an extremely important point when we want to talk about solutions. And if I may make a link with what you were raising as a question, with the question of prevention. And I think each time we are asking ourselves questions about prevention, we need to go back to the why. So what are the origins of these situations of violence? What are the causes? And as you said, very often it's linked with unemployment, with corruption, so lack of opportunities for young people, and so it's the whole social context which can able to understand what is happening. And very often in law we tend to have an approach which is very limited, because we do not necessarily dig into these causes. But I think we are progressing a lot, and if I may make a comparison with terrorism, we have seen that initially in the 2000s, when we have reacted, when the international community has reacted to terrorism, the question was about security. So you had also a militarization of the police, so many common points actually. And now, since the last years, we are starting to talk about the conditions conducive to terrorism, and to talk about economic, social, and cultural rights, how working on these issues might improve the situation and at least answer partially the origins of the problem. So I think from a research perspective, it's exactly the direction in which I would like to go, to link like empirical sociological studies with legal studies, because it's where I think we can find solutions. Thank you.
Yes.
I just want to raise briefly the importance, actually, of the role of the state at the local level. And actually, during my time, our visit to El Salvador, I had the opportunity of availing of the offer of El Salvador government to visit 2 particular communities, which was being headed by municipal mayors who were really gung-ho, not gang-ho, okay, gung-ho about trying to keep their streets safe and providing alternatives to the people from the community. It was very good meetings with the municipal government, in my view, because they really explained that it was very important for them to really have these community-based approaches that was really trying to be effectively providing these conditions that you have mentioned so that there can be more and more normal life, including having inclusive open park spaces. And they were trying to build gyms and have sports club and things like this. For us, it's not really a legal discussion, which is what we like doing. But here, this is where you really see there is an effect. However, when I asked each of the mayors and their staff and some members of the civil society who was there, so this is all very good, but can I now therefore walk in your streets alone? But they said, not yet. So let's hope that with those improvements, or at least attempts and endeavors of the local government, there will actually be a build-up as well from the bottom up concerning how to prevent really the effects of this from really the prevention point of view by setting up such conditions.
Excellent. We have 10 minutes, so we actually have 2 questions here. Very sorry, I don't think we're going to get all of them.
Thank
Go ahead.
you. I will be brief. I'm
Please.
Guillermo from the region of Mexico. I don't have a specific question, but just a general comment. And it's about the role of the protection of the state. And you've mentioned the protection role of the state must be taken more seriously. We know someone in the north of our country who's taking very seriously, and he's building road because he believes it's the right answer. And we don't believe it's the right one. And I think we're working on many different solutions because there are many different problems. And I think when we're talking about the gang violence, we're talking of very different problems with different origins, different nature. And there is no one-fits-all solution for this. So we need to address these questions by empowering people, communities, promoting the social and economic rights, and enhancing development of communities. But I think also one of the questions that we have not addressed here is it's a more global scale of the problem, and we've been saying that on many occasions. And this is, I think, the biggest problem Mexico is facing at this point in time. And this is that we are neighbors of the country which consumes, the first consumer of drugs. So there is a big demand on drugs. They're also the first sellers of weapons. And in the border, there are 9,000 gun shops that people can go there, just buy the guns, and they cross the border with no problem. And this combination of the drug market with the gun violence creates a real problem for the Mexican authorities. And it's not only by working with communities, it's not only a question of poverty, because there's thousands of millions of dollars that have come from the drug market. And with that, you can buy not only people who have no jobs, you can also buy judges, you can buy a lot of people who work in the law enforcement. So the question is not only working at the community level, but also going a bit further in the problem and trying to better understand what's going on to find the best possible solutions. We've been talking about the use of military. You know, there's an ongoing discussion in Mexico right now. And I think it has not been very well understood, the question of the security, internal security law. because there is a lot of criticism of having the military in the streets. The only thing this law is trying to do is to put a legal framework for the operation. It's not to legalize and make the military forces the ones who will be dealing with law enforcement to fight against gangs. It's a bit more complicated. We want to really address this issue based on human rights obligations. Everything that we are working on now is on the basis of the Constitution, and the Constitution, the Article 1, recognizes not only human rights as a primary right for people, but also recognizes that the treaties, international treaties, are applied directly to the legislation. You don't need a specific law to implement human rights treaties in Mexico. They are applied immediately. And all the operation of the military or the armed forces or whoever will be acting to try to I'm sorry. Every corporation that will be fighting against drug cartels will be framed by the human rights obligations of Mexico. And well, basically this is what I wanted to say, and but we need to take a more global approach to this problem. It's not only taking solutions and identifying problems, we need also some solutions. It's easy to say, well, we need to take the military out of the streets. We need also to find some concrete solutions. You take out the military out of the street, and then what's next? And we would like also to have this reflection, but on the basis of a more global approach. What are the roles of other countries? What are the roles of the countries who sell weapons, who consume drugs, where the money comes from? You were talking about the organization, organized armed groups, but this organization does not only operate in a single country. They operate in different countries. They have they're spread around different countries. Some have different roles, but they're all linked to the same problem. And finally, about the community work and the impact that it can have, I think there are very good experiences in Mexico. I don't know if you've heard about Tijuana, but Tijuana used to be one of the most violent cities on earth, and now it's not. It's a place where you can walk freely and without having problems. And the same happens to Ciudad Juarez. Ciudad Juarez has been working a lot in communities, and it's now a safe city. Or of course, it still has its problems, but it's a safer city than it was before. So basically, this is what I wanted to say, and thank you very much for your presentations. I think these kind of meetings are very useful.
Thank you. The last question, I don't know if it was to you or to her, you yourself.
Thank you very much. My name is Angela Cotonero, and I work for the ICC as an advisor on internal displacement. Thanks a lot for the inspiring discussion. I would like to bring on the table one issue from the perspective of a humanitarian organization that tries to mitigate the consequence of armed gang violence. And my comment concerns the capacity, ability, possibility to actually talk to armed gang in order for them to respect more the civilian population. If we're not in an IHL framework, that we don't talk about civilians. But my issue is, you, Gloria, mentioned that these gangs don't have political motivations. And while we understood very clearly from your presentation that this is not a factor that impacts on the possibility or not to consider these armed group as part of an armed conflict whenever other elements are also there, certainly the lack of a political motivation is an element that makes discussing to these people and trying to convince them much more difficult. I mean, if you are dealing with armed groups that wants to take power, to control, etc., then you can always try to bring on the table pragmatic arguments as about the fact that they have an interest in gaining hearts and minds of the population, for example. But with criminal groups that only have criminal motives, finding pragmatic arguments can be much more difficult. So I think it certainly proves what a colleague here was bringing on the table, that's the necessity to become more able to help the community to protect themselves better. But at the same time, I think this also calls for more research, more study, more ideas in terms of understanding these groups, understanding what may be the arguments that will be more appealing to them, in order for us to have a more efficient toolbox that is made both of legal arguments maybe, but also practical arguments to try to make their behavior more respectful of the population.
Yes.
I'm not responding to Angela because we talk all the time. But I would like to respond to the government, to the representative of the mission of Mexico. Thank you very much. But just two things for everybody. 24th of August is when I was in Mexico upon the invitation of the Human Rights Commission of Mexico, and at the end of those 2 days, there was a Declaración de México sobre desplazamiento forzado interno, which it's in the Declaration of Mexico concerning internal displacement, forced internal displacement, which I would like to invite you all to read. And just to conclude that perhaps I will get an invitation from Mexico so that I can walk in the streets of Cinecuala and Tijuana. Thank you.
I think, yes, go ahead.
I will say
Sorry.
something about the comment made by Angela. I think it's a very important comment because it touches on the pragmatics of the issue. So certainly the absence of political motives is probably one of the reasons why humanitarian organizations maybe have less contact with armed gangs. Nevertheless, as we all know, this is also true for other types of organized armed groups. I mean, take the Islamic State. I'm not sure the ICRC is able to have contacts with the Islamic State. So it's not only the issue of political motives which might endanger the communication between humanitarian organizations and organized armed groups. And unfortunately, we can notice in contemporary armed conflict that this is increasingly a problem in very, very different types of armed conflicts. Now, I think we should not abandon the hope of building contacts. I mean, just, and you know that better than anyone else in the room, starting with the humanitarian arguments. Why is it important for the population, for the mothers of the members of the armed gangs, for their brothers, for their sisters, is certainly probably the most, the easiest argument to build a relationship. Thanks.
Ali?
Thanks, Jamil. Yeah, maybe also just to react to the ICRC, because I've been following a lot with your colleagues what you do over the last decade also, since in a way you opened up a lot of these discussions as the ICRC amongst humanitarians and IHL and whatever, with your pilot projects in Rio and in Johannesburg, where suddenly a lot of us are saying, what are you doing there? And the way you've over the last decade been promoting precisely those debates with your presence, I think has helped a lot for a lot of people here in Geneva to get their heads around these new situations that we're dealing with. But I think the one thing also in terms of who you talk to, one last comment that suddenly came up from what you were saying, and that also brings me back to what you were saying right at the beginning as well. I think one mustn't also forget that there is a lot of symbiosis between these groups and the state. It's often saying that there's a state on one side and then there's these gangs, armed actors on the other. And a lot of the time they not only feed off one another, but they also almost need one another for their own existence, for what they do. And there's lots of good research out there that shows that if it's a rebel group, if it's the Maoists in Nepal, or if it's organized crime in Serbia, or if it's a street gangster, there is a lot of symbiosis between those groups and how they identify in contradistinction, but also in relation to the state. And I think that makes it just all the more, I think, tricky, because it's not clearly that there are two sides and that you either talk to one or to the other, or even multiple sides, but everyone's kind of interwoven in a variety of ways. some for personal and economic gain, others for political motivations. I think that's again where they come in. It's often very difficult to know whether a certain gang does something or organized crime does it simply for their own economic benefit, or whether even the mafia wants to be embedded or is embedded in parts of Italian society and therefore is also a service provider, whether you like it or not, for certain public services, which means they also have a political stake in terms of who's the mayor, who's the local governor. So they are implicated in politics in a variety of ways, and asking that question in terms of, well, who are we talking to and why, I think is really at the heart of a lot of this today.
Fantastic. Thank you all very much. I think we had a fantastic discussion. 2 or 3 little things that we could come out, but one of them would be actually the fact that the obvious question that we all have posed here is, how many times do someone needs to be a victim in order to a response to be presented, either legally or in terms of displacement, or in terms of the source of the problem. So actually this is obviously a very complex issue that will need all of these experts put together and many more in order to be dealt in a complex way. And obviously very happy that Cecilia got an invitation to Mexico as well.
I hope I will soon.
Thank you all for coming.